Chapter 6: John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. The Invisibility of Anti-Racism in American History Textbooks. It is not only radical or currently unfashionable ideas that the texts leave out, it is all ideas, including those of their heroes. Francis Fitzgerald. You may dispose of me easily, I'm nearly disposed of now, but this question is still to be settled. This African American question, the end of that is not yet. I am here to plead his cause with you. I plead not for his life, but for his character, his immortal life, and so it becomes your cause wholly, and not his in the least. Henry David Thoreau. A plea for Captain John Brown. We shall need all the anti-slavery feeling in the country, and more. You can go home and try to bring the people to your views, and you may say anything you like about me, if that will help. When the hour comes for dealing with slavery, I trust I will be willing to do my duty, though it cost me my life. Abraham Lincoln to Abolitionist Unitarian Ministers, 1862. Perhaps the most telling criticism of Francis Fitzgerald made in her 1979 survey of American history textbooks, America Revised, was that they leave out ideas. As presented by textbooks of the 1970s, American political life was completely mindless, she observed. Why would textbook authors avoid even those ideas with which they agree? Taking ideas seriously does not fit in with the rhetorical style of textbooks, which presents events as to make them seem foreordained, along the line of constant progress. Including ideas would make history contingent. Things could go either way, and have on occasion. The right, quote, right people armed with the, quote, right ideas have not always won. When they didn't, the authors would be in the embarrassing position of having to disapprove of an outcome in the past. Including ideas would introduce uncertainty. This is not textbook style. Textbooks unfold history without real drama or suspense, only melodrama. On the subject of race relations, John Brown's statement that this question is still to be settled seems almost as relevant today and almost as ominous as when he spoke in 1859. The opposite of racism is anti-racism, of course, or what we might call radical racial idealism or equalitarianism, and it is still not clear whether it will prevail. In this struggle, our history textbooks offer little help. Just as they underplay white racism, they also neglect racial idealism. In so doing, they deprive students of potential role models to call upon as they try to bridge the new fault lines that will spread out in the future from the great rift in our past. Since ideas and ideologies played an especially important role in the Civil War era, American history textbooks give a singularly inchoate view of that struggle. Just as textbooks treat slavery without racism, they treat abolitionism without much idealism. Consider the most radical white abolitionist of them all, John Brown. The treatment of Brown, like the treatment of slavery and Reconstruction, has changed in American history textbooks. From 1890 to about 1970, John Brown was insane. Before 1890, he was perfectly sane, and after 1970, he has slowly been regaining his sanity. Before reviewing 6 more textbooks in 2006-2007, I had imagined that they would maintain this trend, portraying Brown's actions so as to render them at least intelligible, if not intelligent. In their treatment of Brown, however, the new textbooks don't differ much from those of the 1980s, so I shall discuss them all together. Since Brown himself did not change after his death, except to molder more, his mental health in our textbooks provides an inadvertent index of the level of white racism in our society. Perhaps our new textbooks suggest that race relations around 2007 are not much better than around 1987. In the 18 textbooks I reviewed, Brown makes 2 appearances, Pottawatomie, Kansas, and Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Recall that the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act tried to resolve the question of slavery through popular sovereignty. The practical result of leaving the slavery question to whoever settled in Kansas was an ideologically motivated settlement craze. Northerners rushed to live and farm in Kansas territory and make it free soil. Fewer Southern planters moved to Kansas with their slaves, but slave owners from Missouri repeatedly crossed the Missouri River to vote in territorial elections and to establish a reign of terror to drive out the Free Soil farmers. In May 1856, hundreds of pro-slavery border ruffians, as they came to be called, raided the Free Soil town of Lawrence, Kansas, killing 2 people, burning down a hotel, and destroying 2 printing presses. An older textbook, The American Tradition, describes Brown's action at Pottawatomie flatly. In retaliation, a militant abolitionist named John Brown led a midnight attack on the pro-slavery settlement of Pottawatomie. 5 people were killed by Brown and his followers. The 2006 edition of the American Pageant provides a much fuller account, but one that is far from neutral. The fanatical figure of John Brown now stalked upon the Kansas battlefield. Spare, gray-bearded, and iron-willed, he was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause. The power of his glittering gray eyes was such, so he claimed, that his stare could force a dog or cat to slink out of a room. Becoming involved in dubious dealings, including horse stealing, he moved to Kansas from Ohio with a part of his large family. Brooding over the recent attack on Lawrence, Old Brown of Osawatomie led a band of his followers to Pottawatomie Creek in May of 1856. There they literally hacked to pieces 5 surprised men, presumed to be pro-slaverites. This fiendish butchery besmirched the Free Soil cause and brought vicious retaliation from the pro-slavery forces. Pageant's prose is typical of books written during the nadir of race relations, 1890 to 1940, when most white Americans, including historians, felt that blacks should not have equal rights, and comes as something of a shock at the beginning of the 21st century. In this rendering, those who fought for black equality had to be wrong-headed. Indeed, the first edition of this textbook came out in 1956, long before the changes wrought by the Civil Rights Movement had any chance to percolate through our culture and influence the writing of our history textbooks. The choice of language from fanatical figure and dubious dealings to fiendish butchery is hardly objective. One man's stalk is another man's walk. Bias is also evident in the choice of details included and omitted. The account throughout makes Northerners the initial aggressors, omitting the mention of the earlier murders by pro-slavery Southerners. Actually, Free Staters, being in the majority, had tried to win Kansas democratically and legally. It was pro-slavery forces that had used terror and threats to try to control the state. No reader of Pageant would guess that pro-slavery men had recently killed 5 Free State settlers, including the 2 slain in the Lawrence raid. Nor had Brown moved to Kansas with his large family. Rather, he had moved to the Adirondacks, hoping his sons would join him there, but 5 sons and their families instead went to Kansas, hoping to farm in peace. Then they asked their father for aid when threatened by their pro-slavery neighbors. Other errors include presumed to be pro-slavery rights. They were, and literally hacked to pieces. They weren't. Of all 18 textbooks, another of the new books, Pathways to the Present, is the most sympathetic to Brown, but never goes beyond neutrality. It compactly describes Brown's Harper's Ferry raid. On October 16, 1859, the former Kansas raider John Brown and a small group of men attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown and his followers hoped to seize the weapons and give them to enslaved people to start a slave uprising. United States troops under the command of Robert E. Lee cornered and defeated Brown's men. Convicted of treason, Brown was sentenced to be hanged. Just before his execution, he wrote a note that would prove to be all too accurate. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. 8 other books, new and older, are negative, though they don't imply he was crazy. The other 9 are openly hostile. Several textbooks, including 4 of the 6 recent ones, emphasize the claim that no slaves actually joined Brown. Borston and Kelly makes the point at length. The party forcibly freed about 30 slaves, taking these reluctant people with them. Brown and his men retreated to the arsenal. Ironically, the first person to die in the affair, killed by John Brown and his men, was an already free black gunned down by these liberators. The United Daughters of the Confederacy would love these accounts because they can be taken to imply that African Americans had no interest in freedom. The UDC erected a monument in Harper's Ferry to Haywood Shepherd, the free black man referred to by Borston and Kelly. At its dedication in 1931, they claimed he was a representative of African Americans of the neighborhood who would not take part. But this is bad history. Hannah Gefford and Jean Libby have shown that Brown drew considerable support from enslaved African Americans around Harper's Ferry. His men armed the 30 mentioned by Borston and Kelly, including some who came from nearby plantations that the raiders never visited. These newly freed men then stopped the eastbound passenger train, guarded it, and helped the raiders find other slave owners, and probably killed an armed white resident of the town who refused to halt when challenged. After the raid, the state indicted 11 of them for these actions. While after the raid, local African Americans continued the resistance to slavery that Brown's raid had triggered. Libby notes that many slaves from the area were listed as fugitive in the 1860 census, and the barns of all the jurors of John's Brown's trial were burned, a time-honored signal of revolution. Thus, the UDC interpretation that textbooks supply, implying that the slaves themselves were not sympathetic to the cause of abolition, is simply inaccurate. 4 textbooks still linger in the former era when Brown's actions proved him mad. John Brown was almost certainly insane, opines American History. The American Way tells a whopper. Later, Brown was proved to be mentally ill. The 2006 American pageant, like its predecessor, characterizes Brown as deranged, gaunt, grim, and terrible. Says that 13 of his near relatives were regarded as insane, including his mother and grandmother, and terms the Harper's Ferry raid a mad exploit. Other books finesse the sanity issue by calling Brown merely fanatical. Not one author, old or new, has any sympathy for the man or takes any pleasure in his ideals or actions. For the benefit of readers who, like me, grew up reading that John Brown was at least fanatic, if not crazed, let's consider the evidence. To be sure, some of Brown's lawyers and relatives, hoping to save his neck, suggested an insanity defense, but no one who knew Brown thought him crazy. He favorably impressed people who spoke with him after his capture, including his jailer and even reporters writing for the Democratic newspapers which supported slavery. Governor Wise of Virginia called him a man of clear head. After Brown got the better of him in an informal interview, they are themselves mistaken who take him to be a madman, Governor Wise said. In his message to the Virginia legislature, he said Brown showed quick and clear perception, rational premises, and consecutive reasoning, composure, and self-possession. After 1890, textbook authors inferred Brown's madness from his plan, which admittedly was far-fetched. Never mind that John Brown himself presciently told Frederick Douglass that the venture would make a stunning impact even if it failed, nor that his 20-odd followers can hardly all be considered crazed too. Rather, we must recognize that the insanity with which historians have charged John Brown was never psychological, it was ideological. Brown's actions made no sense to textbook writers between 1890 and about 1970. To make no sense is to be crazy. Clearly, Brown's contemporaries did not consider him insane. Brown's ideological influence in the month before his hanging and continuing after his death was immense. He moved the boundary of acceptable thoughts and deeds regarding slavery. Before Harper's Ferry, to be an abolitionist was not quite acceptable, even in the North. Just talking about freeing slaves, advocating immediate emancipation, was behavior at the outer limit of the ideological continuum. By engaging in armed action, including murder, John Brown made mere verbal abolitionism seem much less radical. After an initial shockwave of revulsion against Brown in the North, as well as in the South, Americans were fascinated to hear what he had to say. In his 1859 trial, John Brown captured the attention of the nation like no other abolitionist or slave owner before or since. He knew it. My whole life before had not afforded me one half the opportunity to plead for the right. In his speech to the court on November 2nd, just before the judge sentenced him to die, Brown argued, "Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, it would have been all right." He referred to the Bible, which he saw in the courtroom, which teaches me all the things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further that to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavored to act upon that instruction, Brown went on to claim the high moral ground. I believe that to have inferred as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, I did no wrong but right. Although he objected that his impending death penalty was unjust, he accepted it and pointed to the graver injustices. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say let it be done. Brown's willingness to go to the gallows for what he thought was right had a moral force of its own. It seems as if no man had ever died in America before, for in order to die you must have lived, Henry David Thoreau observed in a eulogy in Boston. These men, in teaching us how to die, have at the same time taught us how to live. Thoreau went on to compare Brown with Jesus of Nazareth, who faced a similar death at the hands of the state. During the rest of November, Brown provided the nation graceful instruction on how to face death. In Larchmont, New York, George Templeton Strong wrote in his diary. One's faith in anything is terribly shaken by anybody who is ready to go to the gallows condemning and denouncing it. Brown's letters to his family and friends softened his image, showed his human side, and prompted an outpouring of sympathy for his children and soon-to-be widow, if not for Brown himself. His letters to supporters and remarks to journalists, widely circulated, formed a continuing indictment of slavery. We see his charisma in his letter from a conservative Christian, so the author signed it, written to Brown in jail. While I cannot approve of all your acts, I stand in awe of your position since your capture, and dare not oppose you, lest I be found fighting against God. For you speak as one having authority, and seem to be strengthened from on high. When Virginia executed John Brown on December 2nd, making him the first American since the founding of the nation to be hanged as a traitor, church bells mourned in cities throughout the North. Louisa May Alcott, William Dean Howells, Herman Melville, John Greenleaf Whittier, and Walt Whitman were among the poets who responded to the event. The gaze of Europe is fixed at this moment on America, wrote Victor Hugo from France. Hanging Brown, Hugo predicted, will open a latent fissure that will finally split the Union asunder. The punishment of John Brown may consolidate slavery in Virginia, but it will certainly shatter the American democracy. You preserve your shame, but you kill your glory. Brown remained controversial after his death. Republican congressmen kept their distance from his felonious acts. Nevertheless, Southern slave owners were appalled at the show of Northern sympathy for Brown and resolved to maintain slavery by any means necessary, including quitting the Union if they lost the next election. Brown's charisma in the North, meanwhile, was not spent, but only increased owing to what many came to view as his martyrdom. As the war came, as thousands of Americans found themselves making the same commitment to face death that John Brown had made, the force of his example took on new relevance. That's why soldiers marched into battle singing John Brown's Body. 2 years later, church congregations sang Julia Ward Howe's new words to the song. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. And the identification of John Brown and Jesus Christ took another turn. The next year, the 54th Massachusetts African American Regiment parading through Boston to the tune, en route to its heroic destiny with death in South Carolina, while William Lloyd Garrison surveyed the cheering bystanders from a balcony, his hand resting on a bust of John Brown. In February 1865, another Massachusetts colored regiment marched to the same tune through the streets of Charleston, South Carolina. That was the high point of old John Brown. At the turn of the century, as southern and border states disenfranchised African Americans, as lynchings proliferated, as black-faced minstrel shows came to dominate American popular culture, white America abandoned the last shreds of racial idealism. A history published in 1923 makes plain the connection to Brown's insanity. The farther we get away from the excitement of 1859, the more we are disposed to consider this extraordinary man the victim of mental delusions. Not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s was white America freed from enough of its racism to accept that a white person did not have to be crazy to die for black equality. In a sense, the murders of Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman in Mississippi, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo in Alabama, and various other white civil rights workers in various other southern states during the 1960s liberated textbook writers to see sanity again in John Brown. Rise of the American Nation, written in 1961, calls the Harper's Ferry Plan a wild idea certain to fail, while in Triumph of the American Nation, published in 1986, the plan becomes a bold idea, but almost certain to fail. Frequently, in American history, the ideological needs of white racists and black nationalists coincide. So it was with their views of John Brown. During the heyday of the Black Power movement, I listened to speaker after speaker in a Mississippi forum denounce whites. They are your enemies, thundered one black militant. Not one white person has ever had the interests of black people at heart. John Brown sprang to my mind, but the speaker anticipated my objection. You might say John Brown did, but remember, he was crazy. John Brown might provide a defense against such global attacks on whites, but unfortunately, American history textbooks have erased him as a usable character. No African American person who met John Brown thought him crazy. Many African American leaders of the day, Martin Delany, Henry Highland Gardner, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and others, knew and respected Brown. Only illness kept Tubman from joining him at Harper's Ferry. The day of his execution, black-owned businesses closed in mourning across the North. Frederick Douglass called Brown one of the greatest heroes known to American fame. A black college deliberately chose to locate at Harper's Ferry, and in 1918, its alumni dedicated a memorial stone to Brown and his men to commemorate their heroism. The stone stated in part that this nation might have a new birth of freedom, that slavery should be removed forever from American soil. John Brown and his 21 men gave their lives. Quite possibly, textbooks should not portray this murderer as a hero, although other murderers from Christopher Columbus to Nat Turner get the heroic treatment. However, the flat prose that textbooks use for Brown is not really neutral. Textbook authors' withdrawal of sympathy from Brown is perceptible. Their tone in presenting him is different from the tone they employ for almost everyone else. We see this, for instance, in their treatment of his religious beliefs. John Brown was a serious Christian, well read in the Bible, who took its moral commands to heart. Yet every recent textbook, except Pathway to the Present, does not credit Brown with religiosity, but instead blames him for it. Brown believed that God had called on him to fight slavery, the American says twice, but Brown never believed God commanded him in the sense of giving him instructions. Rather, he thought deeply about the moral meaning of Christianity and decided that slavery was incompatible with it. Borston and Kelly calls Brown the self-proclaimed anti-slavery Messiah, but Brown never thought of himself as a Messiah. On the contrary, he tried to get Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman to join him, believing that enslaved African Americans would be much more likely to follow them than him. By way of comparison, consider Nat Turner, who in 1831 led the most important slave revolt since the United States became a nation. John Brown and Nat Turner both killed whites in cold blood. Both were religious, but unlike Brown, Turner did see visions and hear voices. In most textbooks, Turner has become something of a hero. Several textbooks call Turner deeply religious or a gifted preacher. None calls him a religious fanatic. They reserve that term for Brown. The closest any textbook comes to suggesting that Turner might have been crazy is this passage from American history. Historians still argue about whether or not Turner was insane, but the author immediately goes on to qualify. The point is that nearly every slave hated bondage. Nearly all were eager to see something done to destroy the system. Thus, even American history emphasizes the political and social meaning of Turner's act, not its psychological genesis in an allegedly questionable mind. The textbook's withdrawal of sympathy from Brown is also apparent in what they include and exclude about his life before Harper's Ferry. In the 1840s, he somehow got interested in helping black slaves. According to American Adventures, Brown's interest is no mystery. He learned it from his father, who was a trustee of Oberlin College, a center of the abolitionist settlement. If Adventures wanted, it could have related the well-known story about how young John made friends with an African American boy during the War of 1812, which convinced him that African Americans were not inferior. Instead, its sentence reads like a slur. Textbook authors make Brown's Potawatomi killings seem equally unmotivated by neglecting to tell that the violence in Canvas had hitherto been perpetrated primarily by the pro-slavery side. Indeed, slavery sympathizers had previously killed 6 free soil settlers. Several months after Potawatomi at Osawatomie, Kansas, Brown had helped 35 free soil men defend themselves against several hundred marauding pro-slavery men from Missouri, thereby earning the nickname Osawatomie John Brown. Not one textbook mentions what Brown did at Osawatomie, where he was the defender, but 14 to 18 tell what he did at Potawatomi, where he was the attacker. Our textbook also handicapped Brown by not letting him speak for himself. Even his jailer let Brown put pen to paper. 12 of the 18 textbooks I studied do not provide even a phrase he spoke or wrote. Brown's words, which moved the nation, therefore cannot move most students today. Textbook authors may avoid Brown's ideas because they are tinged with Christianity. Religion has been one of the great inspirations and explanations of human enterprise in this country. Yet textbooks, while they may mention religious organizations such as the Shakers or Christian Science, never treat religious ideas in any period seriously. An in-depth portrayal of Mormonism, Christian Science, or the Methodism of the Great Awakening would be controversial. Mentioning atheism or deism would be even worse. Are you trying to tell kids that Thomas Jefferson didn't believe in Jesus? Not me, a textbook editor exclaimed to me. Treating religious ideas neutrally, non-religiously, simply as factors in society won't do either. For that would for that would likely offend some adherents. The textbook's solution is to leave out religious ideas entirely. Quoting John Brown's courtroom paraphrase of the Golden Rule, whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them, would violate the taboo. Ideological contradiction is terribly important in history. Ideas have power. The ideas that motivated John Brown and the example he set lived on long after his body lay a moldering in the grave. Yet American history textbooks give us no way to understand the role of ideas in our past. Conceivably, textbook authors ignore John Brown's ideas because in their eyes his violent acts make him ineligible for sympathetic consideration. When we turn from Brown to Lincoln, we shift from one of the most controversial to one of the most venerated figures in American history. Textbooks describe Abraham Lincoln with sympathy, of course. Nonetheless, they also minimize his ideas, especially on the subject of race. In life, Abraham Lincoln wrestled with the race question more openly than any other president except perhaps Thomas Jefferson. And unlike Jefferson, Lincoln's actions sometimes matched his words. Most of our textbooks say nothing about Lincoln's internal debate. If they did show it, what teaching devices they would become. Students would see that speakers modify their ideas to appease and appeal to different audiences. So we cannot simply take their statements literally. If textbooks recognize Lincoln's racism, students would learn that racism not only affects the Ku Klux Klan extremists, but has been normal throughout our history. And as they watch Lincoln struggle with himself to apply America's democratic principles across the color line, students would see how ideas can develop and a person can grow. In conversation, Lincoln, like most whites of his century, referred to blacks as racial slurs. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he sometimes descended into explicit white supremacy, as we saw in the last chapter. Lincoln's ideas about race were more complicated than Douglas's, however. The day after Douglas declared for white supremacy in Chicago, saying that the issues were distinctly drawn, Lincoln replied, and indeed drew the issue distinctly. I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean an African American, why does not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not true, let us tear it out. Let us stick to it then. Let us stand firmly by it then. No textbook quotes this passage, but every book but one leaves out Lincoln's thundering summation of what his debates with Douglas were really about. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent, is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. Lincoln's realization of the basic humanity of African Americans may have derived from his father, who moved the family to Indiana partly because he disliked the racial slavery that was sanctioned in Kentucky. Or it may stem from an experience Lincoln had on a steamboat trip in 1841, which he recalled years later when writing to his friend Josh Speed. You may remember as well as I do that from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio, there were on board 10 or 12 slaves shackled together with irons. That night was continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio or any other slave border. Lincoln concluded that the memory still had the power of making me miserable. No textbook quotes this letter or anything like it. As early as 1835, in his first term in the Illinois House of Representatives, Lincoln cast one of only 5 votes opposing a resolution that condemned abolitionists. Textbooks imply that Lincoln was nominated for president in 1860 because he was a moderate on slavery. But in fact, Republicans chose Lincoln over frontrunner William H. Seward, partly because of Lincoln's rock-solid anti-slavery beliefs, while Seward was considered a compromiser. As president, Lincoln understood the importance of symbolic leadership in improving race relations. For the first time, the United States exchanged diplomats with Haiti and Liberia. In 1863, Lincoln desegregated the White House staff, which initiated a desegregation of the federal government that lasted until Woodrow Wilson. Lincoln opened the White House to African American callers, notably Frederick Douglass. He also continued to wrestle with his own racism asking aides to investigate the feasibility of deporting African Americans to Africa or Latin America. Most of the textbooks mention that Lincoln personally opposed slavery. Two even quote his 1864 letter: "If slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong." However, most textbook authors take pains to separate Lincoln from undue idealism about slavery. They venerate Lincoln mainly because he saved the Union. By far their favorite statement of Lincoln's, quoted or paraphrased by 15 of the 18 books, is his letter of August 22nd, 1862 to Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the African American race, I do because I believe it helps save this Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help save the Union." By emphasizing this quote, most textbooks present Lincoln, who was morally indifferent to slavery and certainly did not care about African Americans. As Pathways to the Present puts it, Lincoln came to regard ending slavery as one more strategy for ending the war. Ironically, this is also the Lincoln whom black nationalists present to African Americans to persuade them to stop thinking well of him. To present such a Lincoln, the textbooks have to remove all context. The very first thing they omit is the next point that Lincoln made: "I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." That says something quite different about slavery, of course, so all but 3 textbooks leave that part out. Next, they remove the political context. Every historian knows that the fragment of Lincoln's letter to Greeley that most textbooks quote does not simply represent his intent regarding slavery. Lincoln wrote the letter to seek support for the war from residents of New York City, one of the most democratic and therefore white supremacist cities in the North. He could never hope to win that support by claiming that the war would end slavery. They would be against it on that ground. So he made the only appeal he could: support the war, and it will hold the nation together. He was speaking not to Greeley, who wanted slavery to end, but to anti-war Democrats and anti-black Irish Americans, as well as to governors of the border states and the many other Northerners who opposed emancipating the slaves. Saving the Union had never been Lincoln's sole concern, as shown by his 1860 rejection of the 11th hour Crittenden Compromise, a constitutional amendment intended to preserve the Union by preserving slavery forever. Not one author explains the political context or intended audience for the Greeley letter, nor does a single textbook quote Lincoln's encouragement that same summer to Unitarian ministers to go home and try to bring the people to your views, because we shall need all the anti-slavery feeling in this country and more. If they did, students would understand that Lincoln's response to the issue of slavery in America was hardly indifference.